What if a single medal could hold the weight of a lifetime, not just battles fought on distant soil but years of silence, pain, and sacrifice that no one ever truly saw? Imagine sitting in a courtroom, expecting just another routine case, when suddenly an old, weathered medal is placed gently on the podium. The light from the windows catches its worn edges, and for a brief moment, the entire room forgets about fines, tickets, and paperwork. Everyone wonders, why is it here? The man who set it down did not speak right away. His hand lingered on the medal, trembling slightly, as though letting it go meant reliving everything it represented. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward, his usually warm expression shifting into something far heavier, curiosity mixed with a sense of reverence. This wasn't the kind of evidence he saw every day. This was something deeper. Friends, think about it. What stories could a single piece of metal carry? Whose blood, whose tears, whose promises were tied to it? And why had this man, frail, tired, yet dignified, chosen to bring it here into a courtroom where the law demands numbers, not memories? The audience watched, transfixed. Some tilted their heads, squinting to catch the faint inscription. Others simply sat frozen, sensing that they were on the edge of hearing something unforgettable. The medal didn't just glimmer in the sunlight, it seemed to shine with history, with sacrifice, with a truth no one had asked for but everyone was desperate to know. Judge Caprio broke the silence first. His voice was softer than usual, as though he already understood that this was not a case to be rushed. "Sir," he said gently, "what does this medal mean to you?" The man lifted his eyes, and in them was a story waiting to pour out, decades of service, of loss, of battles that never made the headlines. But he did not answer right away. Instead, he took a breath that shook his chest and whispered words that would change the tone of the entire hearing. "Stay with me, because what unfolded next wasn't just a courtroom moment, it was a revelation that left Judge Caprio and everyone who heard it forever changed." Judge Frank Caprio has long been known as more than just a judge. To some, he is a figure of compassion wearing a black robe. To others, he is the embodiment of what justice should truly be, firm but fair, grounded in the law, yet never blind to humanity. His courtroom is a place where rules matter, but so do people. There is discipline, yes, but also warmth. For those who have watched him over the years, there is always the anticipation that something extraordinary could happen at any moment. On this day, the air carried that same expectation. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the polished wood of the benches. The quiet hum of anticipation filled the room as spectators settled in, unaware that they were about to witness a story far greater than any ordinary case. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses, scanning the docket, his tone calm but steady, commanding respect without ever raising his voice. And then there was the man who stepped forward. His name was Robert. He moved slowly, every step deliberate, not from arrogance but from the weight of years lived and battles endured. His shoulders were slightly stooped, his hair white with age, yet his eyes still carried a spark that spoke of a younger man who had once stood tall in uniform. He was frail, yes, but proud, the kind of pride that doesn't shout but resonates quietly like a song only a few can hear. In his hand he held the medal. It wasn't in a case or display box. It was bare, worn, edges dulled from decades of being touched, carried, and kept close. It was not an ornament for vanity, it was a piece of his life, a fragment of his soul forged in moments no courtroom could ever replicate. When Robert placed it on the podium, the atmosphere shifted. No one knew why he brought it, but everyone felt it mattered. The medal seemed out of place among legal papers and citations, yet it commanded the room as though it belonged more than anything else ever could. Judge Caprio studied it carefully, his expression changing. He was no stranger to people bringing excuses, documents, and even emotional pleas to sway judgment. But this was different. A war medal was not just a symbol, it was a testimony of service, sacrifice, and survival. And now the question lingered in everyone's minds: what story was hidden within it? Robert did not rush to explain. He simply stood there, one hand resting on the podium, the other hovering near the medal, as if even now he was reluctant to let it go. His breathing was steady but heavy, like a man who had carried burdens for far too long. Friends, imagine the curiosity that gripped the audience. Who was this man before them? What had he endured? And why, of all places, would he bring this piece of his history into a courtroom where unpaid fines and minor violations were usually the focus? The prosecutor shuffled papers, perhaps preparing to address the violation on record. But even he hesitated, sensing that whatever this man was about to say would reach beyond statutes and regulations. The courtroom seemed suspended, balanced between routine and revelation. Robert's presence was humbling. There was no arrogance, no sense of entitlement. Instead, there was a quiet dignity in the way he held himself, as though he knew his story didn't need embellishment, it only needed to be told. And yet, the mystery of why he brought the medal remained unsolved. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Robert's face. His voice, gentle but firm, broke the silence. "Sir, I can see that medal means something important. But I need to ask, why bring it here today?" The question hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation all at once. Robert's lips pressed together, his eyes glancing at the medal before lifting back toward the bench. His expression was both weary and resolute. And though he hadn't yet answered, everyone knew the truth would not be simple. Because this medal was not just a relic of the past. It was a vessel of memory, sacrifice, and pain. And soon, the courtroom would learn that behind this one piece of metal lay years of untold stories that no one could have imagined. Robert's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the medal again, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as though it might shatter if he pressed too hard. He drew in a breath, the kind of breath that comes before a confession long held back, and then he began. "This medal," he said softly, his voice cracked by age and memory, "was given to me many years ago when I was just a young man. Back then I didn't feel frail. I didn't feel tired. I was full of strength, full of purpose. I wore a uniform and I thought that meant I could carry the world on my shoulders." The courtroom fell still. You could hear the faint shifting of someone on a bench, but beyond that, there was nothing but Robert's voice and the faint hum of air in the room. "I earned it in a place far from here," he continued, eyes distant, as though he were no longer standing in the courtroom but standing on battlefields long gone. It was hot, loud, and unforgiving. Every day we carried not only our weapons but the weight of not knowing if we would live to see another sunrise. This medal, it reminds me of survival. But it also reminds me of those who didn't come home." He paused, his throat tight, his knuckles white around the small piece of metal. "I carry their faces with me every day. Men who were my brothers, who laughed with me in the quiet moments, who wrote letters they never got to send. This medal doesn't shine for me. It shines for them." Judge Caprio listened intently, his chin resting lightly against his hand, eyes fixed on the man before him. Robert lowered the medal onto the podium again, carefully, reverently. "When I came back, people clapped for us at the airport. They told us we were heroes. But you know what happens after the cheering stops? Life doesn't wait for you to catch up. You're left with memories you can't share, nightmares you can't escape, and a world that moves on without you." His voice grew heavier. "I tried to build a normal life. I worked. I married. I raised kids. But the battles never really ended, Your Honor. Not in here." He tapped his chest with one hand, his eyes glistening. The audience leaned forward, caught between admiration and sorrow. This wasn't just about a medal anymore, it was about a man carrying invisible wounds no one could see. Robert explained how his health had begun to fail. Years of physical labor wore down his body, and the stress of holding everything together took its toll. His wife passed away too soon, leaving him alone in a small apartment. His children moved away to chase lives of their own, and though they loved him, the distance grew. Nights became long, days became quiet. "Bills don't stop coming just because you're tired," he said, his voice laced with bitterness but not anger. "The pension is small, the medications are expensive, and the body doesn't forgive the way it used to. So sometimes you make choices. You pay for what keeps you alive and you ignore the rest." That's how those tickets piled up. Not because I didn't care about the law. Not because I wanted to ignore my duty. But because survival doesn't come with instructions. His honesty weighed heavy in the room. There was no performance in his voice, no attempt to manipulate. He was simply telling the truth, and it was a truth that pierced through the sterile walls of the courtroom. Friends, imagine holding that medal in your hands. Would you see victory? Would you see glory? Or would you see the scars it represents? The nights of silence, the faces never forgotten, the battles fought alone long after the war had ended? Robert's eyes shifted toward Judge Caprio once again. "I brought it here today not to excuse myself, but to remind everyone that behind every mistake, behind every violation, there's a story. This medal is mine. It carries everything I've lived and everything I've lost. I thought maybe if you could see it, you'd understand." The room sat frozen, wrapped in the gravity of his words. And yet, even as Robert revealed pieces of his life, it was clear there was still more, truths locked behind his trembling lips, waiting to be spoken. The prosecutor rose slowly from his chair, clearing his throat as he gathered the file before him. His tone was not cruel but clinical, the voice of the law stripped of emotion. "Your Honor," he began, "the facts of this case are straightforward. The defendant has accumulated multiple unpaid parking and traffic citations. These have been issued over a span of several months, each one ignored despite repeated notices. The penalties have grown, and the balance now owed is significant. He turned a page, the sound echoing in the silence. On paper, this is a matter of negligence. The law makes no exception for age or circumstance. If every citizen disregarded their obligations, our system would collapse. Respect for the law requires enforcement. His words were measured, logical, irrefutable, at least in the sterile world of statutes and regulations. But in the courtroom that day, those words collided with the image of Robert, standing frail but proud, a war medal glinting faintly on the podium. Robert's eyes dropped to the floor, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the stand. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the prosecutor's sharpness. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I did not ignore those tickets out of defiance. I ignored them because I had to choose between paying them and paying for my medication." The words landed heavy, shifting the air in the room. "Every month," Robert continued, "my pension comes in. It's not much. By the time I pay rent, utilities, and the pharmacy, there's barely enough for food. I live alone. Some nights I eat bread and canned soup. Some nights I eat nothing. And when the envelope with those tickets arrived, I put it in a drawer because I knew I couldn't afford it. I chose to stay alive instead." He took a breath, his chest rising and falling with effort. "If that makes me guilty, then I suppose I am guilty. But I hope you understand why." The prosecutor shifted uneasily in his chair, perhaps realizing that the black and white clarity of law was dissolving into the gray of human struggle. Robert's gaze lifted again, his eyes clouded but piercing. "There's another reason I struggle, Your Honor. Nights aren't easy for me. When the house is quiet and the lights are out, the war comes back. Faces, voices, moments I'll never forget. I wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, and I can't tell if I'm still in those jungles or if I'm here. Those memories don't go away. They follow you home. They live in you." A hush fell over the courtroom. Spectators leaned forward, their faces softened with empathy. This was no longer about unpaid tickets. This was about a man haunted by battles the law could never put in a ledger. Friends, imagine being forced to choose between survival and compliance. Imagine opening a bill you cannot pay, knowing that your health, your sanity, your very breath depends on money you don't have. Would you have chosen differently? Or would you too have let the tickets pile up, telling yourself you'd deal with them tomorrow while fighting to make it through today? Judge Caprio remained silent, but his eyes revealed the conflict within him. He understood the law, the necessity of order. Yet before him stood a man who had already sacrificed more than most citizens ever would, a man carrying wounds the legal code could not measure. Robert's hand brushed the metal again. "I've lived my whole life trying to honor what this stands for. But honor doesn't pay rent. Honor doesn't buy insulin. Honor doesn't keep you warm in the winter. I'm not here to excuse myself. I'm here because the world doesn't leave much room for people like me anymore." The courtroom was torn between two truths, the necessity of law and the reality of struggle. The prosecutor's file told one story, Robert's trembling voice told another. Suspense hung in the air like a storm cloud, and everyone wondered the same thing. When the moment of decision came, would Judge Caprio see only numbers on paper, or the man behind them? Robert's voice dropped lower, so low that for a moment the audience had to lean in to hear him. His hands lingered on the metal, his fingers brushing its edges as though each touch reawakened memories long buried. His breathing grew uneven, and when he finally spoke, the weight of his words settled heavily across the room. "This metal," he began, pausing as though the words themselves resisted leaving his chest. "It isn't only mine. I've carried it for decades, but in truth, it belongs to someone else." The silence was instant, sharp, as though the entire courtroom had inhaled together and forgotten how to exhale. Even the prosecutor, who had been poised with his papers ready, froze in place, his pen slipping from his fingers. Judge Caprio's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in anticipation, sensing that what was about to come would change the very nature of this case. Robert's gaze drifted upward, not to anyone in the room, but to a place far away, a battlefield half a lifetime ago. "He was my closest friend. We were boys when we signed up, barely old enough to understand the world but old enough to be sent to fight. We went everywhere together, ate the same rations, shared the same jokes, prayed the same prayers at night. He was brave in ways I never was. Stronger. Smarter. He should have been the one to come home, not me." A tremor passed through his lips, but he pushed forward. "One night, during an ambush, we were pinned down. The air was fire, smoke, and chaos. I remember crawling through mud, hearing nothing but gunfire and the screams of men I'll never forget. And then, I found him. He was hit bad. I tried to stop the bleeding, I tried everything I could, but we both knew he wasn't going to make it. Robert's voice cracked, and his hand pressed firmly against the metal. He took this off his own chest and pressed it into my hand. And with his last breath he said, "Take it. Tell them I wasn't afraid." Then he was gone. And I've carried it every single day since. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. A woman in the back covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. A man wiped his eyes, trying to mask the tremor in his jaw. The metal on the podium no longer looked like just an artifact of service. It looked like a piece of someone's soul. Robert's shoulders slumped as if the confession had finally torn through years of silence. This metal isn't about me. It's about him. About the life he never got to live, the family he never got to start, the future he never saw. Every time I look at it, I feel pride, but I also feel guilt. Because I walked away and he didn't. I came home and he was buried far from here. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his face softening, the weight of Robert's words pressing down on him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes, a silence of reverence, of respect, of understanding. The prosecutor, once so firm in presenting the case, now stared down at the desk, unable to look Robert in the eyes. Even he could not summon the language of the law against such a truth. Robert closed his eyes briefly before whispering, "Every mistake I've made since then, every hardship, it all feels tied to this. Because when you're carrying the memory of a man braver than yourself, you don't see your own life the same way. You just see what he lost." The room was still, but the emotion was alive in every face. For the first time, everyone understood. The metal wasn't a shield or an excuse. It was a burden, one of guilt, survival, and a promise that refused to die. And in that moment, the courtroom knew. This case was no longer about tickets or fines. It was about a lifetime carried inside a single piece of metal. Robert's body trembled as though the weight of the story he had just shared had finally broken something loose inside him. His hand clutched the podium, knuckles white as he struggled to steady himself. The metal glimmered faintly under the lights, lying there like a piece of unfinished history. His voice cracked, and when he spoke again, the courtroom leaned in as though every syllable might vanish if they did not hold on to it. "Your Honor, do you know what it means to carry another man's last words? Every choice I've made, every step I've taken since that night, has been shaped by him. I promised him I would live, not for me but for him. And yet, every time I stumbled, every time I failed, I felt as though I failed him too." He closed his eyes and tears rolled freely down his cheeks. "I see his face in my dreams. I hear his voice when the nights are too quiet. When I hold this metal, I don't just remember him. I remember the sound of his breathing as it stopped. I remember the way his hand grew cold in mine. And I ask myself, why him? Why not me? Why am I the one who got to live?" The silence in the courtroom was unbearable. You could hear the faint rustle of a tissue as someone dabbed at their eyes. A woman in the front row sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. Even the prosecutor, hardened by years of arguing facts and evidence, stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tight. Robert's voice rose, trembling but insistent. "I tried to live a life that would make him proud. I worked hard, I raised my family, I stayed strong when I wanted to give up. But the truth is, Your Honor, I've never been free. This medal isn't just an honor. It's a chain. It reminds me that I lived when he didn't, and nothing I do can change that. So when I look at these fines, these tickets, they feel like dust compared to the promise I've carried. They feel so small, and yet here I am, standing before you as though I've betrayed him again." His chest heaved with sobs now, his frail frame shaking as he gripped the wood in front of him. His dignity remained, but it was wrapped in the rawest vulnerability the courtroom had ever seen. Judge Caprio's eyes glistened. He leaned slightly forward, his lips pressed tightly together, his hand covering his chin. It was the posture of a man who bore witness not just to testimony, but to truth that cut deeper than any courtroom had the capacity to hold. Friends, imagine sitting in that room, watching this man unravel decades of silence in front of strangers. Imagine hearing not just the story of survival, but the confession of a lifetime carried in guilt and love. Could you have sat still? Could you have judged him by the law alone? The audience clung to the moment, breaths held, hearts aching, because they all knew what was coming next. Judge Caprio would have to speak. And the suspense was unbearable. How could justice respond to a man who had already carried a burden heavier than any law could measure? Judge Caprio sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. His eyes shifted from the metal to Robert's trembling frame, then to the faces of the audience, each one heavy with emotion. He took a slow breath, folded his hands on the bench and finally spoke. "Robert," he began softly, "you stand before this court today accused of unpaid fines, of disregarding tickets issued to you. By the strict measure of the law there is no question, you are guilty." Robert lowered his head, ready to accept the weight of punishment. But Caprio's voice, steady and deliberate, did not stop. "Yet," he continued, his tone deepening, "justice is not only about guilt or innocence. Justice is about understanding. It is about compassion. It is about remembering that behind every case, there is a human being, with a story we cannot ignore." He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Robert. "You have carried something far heavier than fines, far heavier than any penalty this court could impose. You have carried the memory of a brother in arms, a man who gave his life for this country. And you have carried that memory with dignity, with loyalty, and with love. That metal is not simply metal. It is the embodiment of sacrifice." The audience stirred, sniffles echoing softly as people wiped their eyes. "If I were to punish you," Judge Caprio said firmly, "it would diminish the very meaning of that sacrifice. The law must be upheld, but mercy is also the highest form of justice. Therefore I am dismissing all fines against you. You will not carry this burden any longer." Robert's head snapped up, his eyes wide, tears spilling freely. His lips trembled as though searching for words but finding only a whisper, thank you, Your Honor." Caprio nodded, his own voice softening. "Your comrade's memory lives not in punishment but in respect. And today we honor him through you. Walk out of this courtroom not as a guilty man, but as a man whose story has reminded us all what true justice means." The room erupted in quiet sobs. Strangers looked at Robert with reverence, their tears flowing not for the law dismissed, but for the humanity restored. Sometimes, friends, the most powerful stories don't come from the evidence presented or the arguments made. They come from a single object, small in size but infinite in meaning. That day it was a medal, worn, scratched, carried through decades of silence. At first glance it looked like a token of honor. But in truth, it was a vessel for grief, loyalty, and sacrifice that no fine or citation could ever measure. Robert's story reminded everyone that behind every case is a human being. Behind every name on paper, there is a lifetime of struggles, triumphs, and scars. One medal carried years of untold stories, but it took compassion to reveal their worth. Judge Caprio showed us that justice is not just about enforcing the law. It's about listening, about understanding, and about knowing when mercy itself becomes the highest form of judgment. Think about it. What would you have done if you were in Judge Caprio's chair? Would you have enforced the fines as written, or would you have looked deeper into the man standing before you? This is not just a question for a courtroom, it's a question for life. How often do we judge people by what we see on the surface, without knowing the weight they carry underneath? Friends, tell us in the comments, do you believe Judge Caprio made the right choice? Your thoughts matter because they reflect the kind of world we all want to build. One defined by rules alone or one shaped by humanity. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember that compassion still exists in this world. And if it stirred something in your heart, let it not end here. Give this story a like, not just for numbers, but to spread a message that kindness and understanding can change lives. One medal. One promise. One man who carried both until the very end. And one judge who reminded us all that mercy has the power to heal. But this was not the last time Judge Caprio faced such a choice. Soon, another case would test him even further, one that would push the very limits of justice itself. That story is next.